Once upon a time, on a September night in 1931, three friends were walking the grounds of Magdalen College, Oxford. C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and their comrade Hugo Dyson. They were talking about myth and metaphor and their role in the whole construction of language and literature, when the very pre-Christian Lewis said something that really got Tolkien's dander up. Beautiful as these stories might be, Lewis avowed, they were, unfortunately, not true. Lies, he said, and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver. No, Tolkien said, they are not lies. According to Lewis, the moment those words were uttered, there was a rush of wind which came so suddenly on the still, warm evening and sent so many leaves pattering down that we thought it was raining. Those of you familiar with Lewis's conversion will know that this late-night conversation with Tolkien over the truth of myth was the last straw, ultimately goading Lewis into his acknowledgement of Christ as Lord. But why was Tolkien so adamant? Why did it matter so much that myths were not lies? So much so that Lewis went home to seriously contemplate the claims of Christianity, and Tolkien went home to write a poem about his convictions. Mythopia, he called it, the making of myth. We tend to think of myth as merely something we use to explain something we don't understand, that the unlearned propagate myth and the wise debunk it. But that's a relatively modern and rather narrow-minded assessment. From our earliest history, humans have turned to story to help explain the adventure of our existence, to articulate experience, if you will. We come into the world wanting to understand it and to understand ourselves within it. What's more, we want to believe that the world matters and that it has meaning. Myths contain foundational truths, and myth-making helps us to narrate and uncover those truths. Myth helped our ancestors make sense of the world around them. It helped them engage with it imaginatively in a way that went far beyond what they could merely understand scientifically. Stars were not just matter in a ball, but constellations immortalized to communicate something important about human nature. People didn't just spring into existence out of nowhere, or worse, ooze out of some primordial swamp. They were born, in many traditions, from the gods themselves. Tolkien expressed this instinctual tendency to apprehend reality by engaging with it imaginatively in his poem Mythopia, which I just mentioned. He sees no stars who does not see them first, of living silver made that sudden bursts to flame like flowers beneath the ancient song, whose very echo after music long has since pursued. There is no firmament, only a void, unless a jeweled tent myth-woven and elf-patterned, and no earth unless the mother's womb whence all have birth. After his conversion, Lewis wrote famously that Christianity is a myth, which is also a fact. It's a fact because it emerged from an age-old tradition of legend and longing and imagination into actual human history. The forerunning myth of the dying God, of which every tradition has some version in some form or another, came true on the cross. Now, in order to get past any squeamishness that might be associated with the concept that Christianity is a myth, which is also a fact, we need first to set aside the modern assumption that myth is merely something that's untrue. And then we need to engage with myth as an imaginative force, a vehicle for the imagination, which, after all, is its primary function, its real function. We've all inherited a mythic imagination, whether we realize it or not. The urge to interpret life via story. Psychologists might call it constructing a narrative around certain inexplicable events or desires, but we all have this capacity, and we all use it to a certain extent. In saying that Christianity is a myth, which is also a fact, we're asserting that even before God took on human flesh in the incarnation, that the world was haunted by the far-off song of the gospel. that the ancient longing for reconciliation with God was present and at work in the world, stirring hearts and imaginations in a place beyond knowledge, and that the satisfaction of all these gathered up longings, past, present, and future, was realized on the cross. Tolkien says that there cannot be any story without a fall, that all stories are ultimately about the fall, because that's the native bent of the human story. But the good news is that there's been an extra literal force at work from the dawn of time, and that not only the consolation, but the satisfaction of the sorrows of the fall have entered human history by way of the incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection of Christ. We must not be ashamed of the mythical radiance resting on our theology, Lewis writes, because myth bridges the gap between abstract and experiential truth. Myth is not truth, but it gives us an experience of what truth is like. Now, both Lewis and Tolkien were scholars and dons at one of the greatest universities in the world. They dealt in truths every day of their lives. And what Tolkien was getting at in his insistence on the truth of myth was that there's more than one way of interacting with truth. We engage with truth by knowing, which is a conclusion arrived at by reason. But we also approach truth by experience, and that's a process that engages our imagination. The problem is that truth by knowing is limited and it's incomplete. It's only part of the picture. It's an abstraction. It's an idea of the real thing as opposed to the real thing. That's why Lewis said that reason divorced from imagination was a lie. But myth, or truth that's presented in story form, helps us connect the two, helps us reintegrate reason and imagination. And if you'll stick with me, I'll try to tell you why. Truth, Lewis tells us, is always about something, but reality is that about which truth is. Truth is about facts, but reality is what gives facts, and lives for that matter, meaning. Reality is where meaning lives. According to Lewis, reason is the natural organ of truth. The function of rationalism is to apprehend and digest truth, but imagination is the natural organ of meaning. So reason is to truth as imagination is to meaning. Always have to let that sink in for a minute. Reason is to truth as imagination is to meaning. And myth occupies this middle ground between the two, between truth and meaning. Truth is a map. It's a signpost pointing the way, but meaning is the place that truth is pointing to, and meaning is our real home. Myth, according to Lewis, is like an isthmus that connects the peninsula of thought and the continent of meaning, that vast continent that we really belong to. Tolkien and Lewis drew on this mythic imagination to reach a place in their readers' hearts and minds that goes beyond mere reason. Imagination doesn't make something true any more than pure reason makes something true. But imagination is the condition under which truth is experienced as opposed to merely known. Imagination can give us an experience of truth that our hearts understand, not just our heads. This is why Lewis wasn't concerned in the least that a child might love Aslan more than Jesus. Because in loving Aslan, a child is experiencing something of what it means to love Jesus. Aslan is not so much a threat as a forerunner. In that sense, the love of Aslan is like the preparation of the soil in a garden to receive good seed, very much like Andrew was talking about with his fantasy stories. The problem that Tolkien was exposing so fervently in his poem and in his assertion that myths are not lies is that the modern worship of reason is misplaced. Rationalism can't answer for everything. I think Tolkien would even argue that modern rationalism isn't all that rational. Rationalism banishes myth to the realm of ignorance and wish fulfillment, ignoring the fact that the makers of myth were imaginatively interpreting the world with a creative force that points back to an original creator. Whence came the wish, and whence the power to dream, Tolkien asks. The right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. Now, the religious view has always held that the material world points to something. Modern materialism, on the other hand, insists that matter is all there is. Now, we all know instinctively, intuitively, more than we can tell or articulate. But what Tolkien was insisting is that the material world and the myths, fables, and tales that have shaped and helped to define our experience of it are telling us more than we can ever merely know. History is one long story of overcorrection. And while the Enlightenment accomplished much in the way of equality, the arts, political reform, it exalted reason at the expense of imagination, imposing a divide that was at once unprecedented, unnatural, and disastrous. For reason, cut off from that vast continent that we really belong to, leads to a loss of meaning, and a loss of meaning leads to despair. Another word for despair is disenchantment. And I think that's one of the saddest words in the English language. It speaks of the bereavement of something that once enchanted. No one needs to tell us that we're living in a disenchanted world, any more than they needed to tell Lewis and Tolkien. The cold materialism that they saw trickling down from the heights of academia is now commonplace. The glamour of Elfland has long been exchanged for cold, hard facts. Our society, much like theirs was beginning to be, is captive to one of two extremes: the denial of all meaning, or the frantic search for meaning in places meaning is never to be found, like success, acquisition, good citizenship, mastery of talent or skill. Now, the ancients believed that there were 5 ages of man, but C.S. Lewis identified 4. They were unenchantment, enchantment, disenchantment, and reenchantment. I'll say those again. Unenchantment, enchantment, disenchantment, and reenchantment. And if unenchantment, like babyhood, is the space before enchantment has occurred, enchantment itself is the golden age. It's the springtime of a year or of a people. It's the first flush of love, the first awakening of heroism or revolution or calling. Lewis uses the very approachable example of a bicycle to explain the 4 ages. As a very small child, there's no such thing as a bicycle on our horizon. Maybe a tricycle, but to a boy of 7 or 8, a bicycle is the very embodiment of flight and freedom. It's the object of longing and the epitome of happiness. This is the age of enchantment, and nothing but a bicycle will do. For the student, however, who must cycle to exams, or the man to his office, the bike becomes no longer Pegasus, but an ordinary workhorse. Enter disenchantment. The sheen of imaginative longing has worn off. The promise of the bike has failed. But here's what Lewis had to say about disenchantment. I would rather have known the idea of the happiness promised in the second age, to know it, even if I'm never to get it, than not to have known it. For even to have wanted it is what makes life worth living. It's the real mark of a human. In other words, the thing that the promise of the bicycle points to remains, even if the promise of the actual bicycle falls short. Enchantment is kindled by joy, and the experience of joy, Lewis says, is that of an unsatisfied desire, which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. This is the core of that beautiful George Eliot quote that's featured on the conference homepage. I'm sure you all saw it. We can never give up longing and wishing while we are thoroughly alive. There are certain things we feel to be beautiful and good, and we must hunger after them. How can we ever be satisfied without them until our feelings are deadened? These words come from the novel The Mill on the Floss, and they're spoken by Philip Wakem, one of the most blighted young men in George Eliot's catalog of tortured characters. He's a cripple. He doesn't get the girl, but he's also an aspiring artist. And no one can tell you better than an artist what it's like to keep longing for the promise in the face of all failure to attain it. But the extraordinary thing, the beautiful thing, is that Lewis and Tolkien didn't believe that disenchantment was the end of the story. They believed in a fourth age, an age of re-enchantment. Their great project, writes Malcolm Guite, was to heal the widening split between outer and inner, rational and imaginative, to heighten and deepen our awareness by re-enchanting the disenchanted, by re-mythologizing a demythologized world. But how do they go about this? Well, the essence of re-enchantment is recovery. It's something that Lewis referred to as retrieving the shell. So picture, if you will, a beautiful seashell lying still and remote at the bottom of a clear, deep pool. That shell is like the truth kernel at the heart of the original enchantment. It's the promise that the object of the enchantment, the bicycle or the first love or the artistic ambition, can never wholly fulfill. But by its very existence, it evidences something that does. This gives it worth. It makes it real, if you will. Or think about it this way. Think about the act of falling in love. I'm not talking about puppy love. I mean that first wild, true, sweet plunge into absolute otherness. In-loveness is the ultimate enchantment, and no matter how the story unfolds, in-loveness does not lie. The much maligned blindness of love is actually the clearest vision that there is, because it gives us the beloved not only as they are, even as they are in some cases, but as they are meant to be. I really believe that the eyes of love give us a glimpse into the essence of what God had in mind when he made that person in the first place. The person may disappoint, but that glimpse is real. And anytime you hear a story or see an example of a couple that's been happily married for a long time, I'm telling you, it's not so much about good communication or boundaries or gender roles or kissing each other goodnight every night. It's about re-enchantment, again and again and again. It's about two people willing to believe in the promise that love's first glimpse gave them, while allowing each other to become the people they are within the context of a shared life. The promise at the core of enchantment is like a hook sunk deep in the heart, and the name we have for it this side of eternity is longing. That's why I believe that no true enchantment can be evil. It might be perverted, distorted, warped by the fallen mind, twisted into obsession or addiction, but every true longing has its origin in homesickness. Every twitch on that hook is evidence of our exile. To retrieve that shell is to acknowledge that the longing is valid, and then to bring it up to the surface in a new context that's consistent with its real purpose, which, as we've said, is to point. Now, there's not just one way to do this, but story is a tried and true means for the kind of recovery that we're talking about. Recovery implies that something has been lost. In this case, the wonder of a world crammed with meaning and the sense of ourselves as loved and valued players caught up in a story of ultimate and perfect redemption. Recovery, in fact, was identified by Tolkien as one of the main functions of fairy tales, which, in his mind, were merely humbler, though no less vital, versions of myth. We need, Tolkien says, to clean our windows, to see things not merely as they are, but as we were meant to see them. We tend to appropriate what we think we already understand, the things or people or places that we know. But Tolkien likens this overfamiliarity to hoarding. Familiarity, in this case, breeds not contempt, but blindness. Myth, fairy tale, creative fantasy, story can help us recover the wonder of the familiar by articulating it in an unfamiliar setting. Apples were golden in the old tales, Chesterton tells us, to refresh the moment when we found they were green. I think that's why Chesterton had such a gripe with modern fiction. The fairy tale, he tells us, follows a normal human boy with startling adventures. The modern psychological novel, on the other hand, follows an abnormal hero whom the fiercest of adventures fail to affect. Fairy tale, he says, is what a sane man will do in a mad world. The realistic modern novel, on the other hand, is what a lunatic will do in a dull world. The world of Middle-earth was one of the most redemptive, if not the most redemptive, literary gift of the 20th century. Without sacrificing the least scrap of humanity in his characters, Tolkien gives us a world that's not only fraught with meaning, but saturated with grace. It's an unfamiliar world in which we feel immediately at home. Why? Because it's true. Not factually, of course, but essentially, resonantly, because it's true to something that's already written in our hearts. We're wired for redemption. Our hearts know it when we see it, whether we fully recognize it or not. He set eternity in their hearts, says the writer of Ecclesiastes. And whenever a story plucks our heart with a reminder or an affirmation or even a hint of ultimate redemption, there's truth embedded at its core. Now, the beautiful thing about recovery is that it need not be over-concerned with originality. Originality for its own sake breeds superficial art at one extreme and destructive art at the other. And I think it's safe to say that our modern world is plagued with both. And they're both toxic to recovery, to the recovery of meaning and the diffusion of the gospel into our society. Without painting with too broad a brush, I think it's important to acknowledge that while the secular world seems to have the market cornered on destructive art, it's by and large the Christian community that's become known for the superficial, the coziness, if you will, of art that's unwilling or afraid to dig too deep for fear of digging up something unpleasant. The climate of our world and a new era of the church, I really believe, is pushing that boundary. And I think that we are indeed living in the early days of a renaissance of Christian art and artisanship. But it's to our peril that we underestimate the pitfalls of originality. Tolkien calls it a weariness and warns against a distrust of beauty on one hand and an irreverence for it on the other. Modern culture and the books, music, and art that shape it seems to be obsessed with unmaking everything that's come before, or with taking old forms and manipulating them into the grotesque and the obscene, as if the ugly and shocking were somehow more true than the beautiful and the good. There's a fork at the road at the end of that third age of disenchantment, a choice between reclamation and further deterioration, a path leading up and a path leading down. But the true road of escape, writes Tolkien, is not to be found in the willfully awkward, clumsy, or misshapen, not in making all things dark or unremittingly violent. Before we reach such states, we need recovery. Now, to aid in the work of recovery, Lewis and Tolkien turned, appropriately enough, to what had enchanted them: Norse myth, fairy tale, medieval texts and manuscripts. Though Lewis's first love was classical philosophy, he identified himself as a medievalist. And all of his stories are laced with this mindset to a certain extent. That's a fascinating study, but despite post-Enlightenment and I don't mean to be so down on the Enlightenment, but despite post-Enlightenment caricatures of this era, and we have that mindset to thank for a lot of our misconceptions about the medieval period, it was not a quagmire of ignorance and superstition. The Middle Ages saw some of the most transformative developments in scholarship, theology, philanthropy, and the arts the world had ever known. What's more, and more to our purposes, the medieval era was a time of intense and intentional sacramentalism. The medieval worldview was essentially sacramental. What I mean by this is that the so-called sacred-secular divide simply did not exist. The ideology of this time was so gospel-centric that everything bore the potential to reveal something about who God is and his relationship with the creatures that he'd made. Medievals read nature like a book that was encoded with endless affirmations of God's character. In fact, they called nature God's second book. And they found endless opportunity to recognize and interact with him on a sensory level. Middle English love lyrics are so integrated with spiritual themes that they read like hymns to Christ and his mother. On the other hand, the devotional poetry of the time is so infused with traditional marriage motifs and human romantic tension that it's often hard to tell if it's a poem about a man and a woman or Christ and his bride. The delightful medieval bestiaries blend rather imaginative scientific facts with attributes of Christ as observed in the lives of animals, like lions and eagles and pelicans. Also, unicorns and phoenixes, which from Harry Potter we all know were real, exist. But in this sense, medieval sacramentalism is very much a two-edged sword, because it flies in the face of the rather Protestant tendency to dismiss physical matter as unspiritual. But it also defies the materialist view that matter is all there is. God made all things, and in Christ, God became what he made. To a medieval, this wasn't just an abstract theological assertion. This changed everything. The God of the universe had ennobled human flesh with his incarnation, and the impact of this act resounded throughout his entire creation. Nothing in the created order is now off limits as an image bearer. Just like a fairy tale, everything is more than it seems. Everything has meaning. Everything points. If you've ever peeked inside a beehive, my husband and I are beekeepers, sort of. But you'll know that the easiest way to locate a queen, the queen in the beehive, is to look where all the tiny stingers of the worker bees are pointing. The thousands and thousands of worker bees are pointing to her. She might be hidden under a pile of bees, but you know she's there. And that's just what all creation does. It points to our King. Lewis depicted the centrality of the incarnation in a beautiful passage from Perelandra. In the fallen world, he prepared for himself a body and was united with the dust and made it glorious forever. This is the end and final cause of all creating, and the sin whereby it came is called fortunate. And the world where this was enacted is the center of worlds, blessed be he. I love that acknowledgement that even the sin which necessitated the incarnation is called fortunate because it serves a purpose in awakening our need for God and revealing the desperation of a world darkened by our separation from him. Sin does not originate from God, but in a sacramental universe, even sin must bow to his redemptive purposes. The medieval anchoress, Julian of Norwich, who I absolutely love, I think her Revelations of Divine Love is one of the most beautiful texts in the English language. But she expressed the same sentiment in a phrase that T.S. Eliot lifted verbatim into his 4 quartets. Sin is behovely, she says. Behovely is an evocative Middle English word for which we don't really have an adequate modern version, but the closest that we can come is needful or necessary. Sin is behovely, but all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. One other aspect of the medieval mindset that I'd like to point out, and I think highly relevant to this discussion, is the medieval's relationship with books and authorship. And I think it ties in well with Tolkien's warning against originality for its own sake. Because a medieval writer would never have presumed to call themselves an author. The concept of authorship as we know it would have been utterly foreign to them. Literature was a long-standing tradition of precedent, reaching back to the authors or authorities of antiquity. To be an author, you had to speak with authority. Your words had to stand the test of time. No author would live to see themselves called such, but nobody seemed to care a bit. There is an extraordinary output of written texts in the Middle Ages, but so much of it is anonymous. The best thing I can liken it to is open source code on the internet. But even the greats, even Chaucer himself, acknowledged their debt to those who had gone before. Medieval writers generally consider themselves translators, literal if not metaphorical scribes, preserving the precious treasures of text in their own vernacular, copying and recopying, adding their own notes into the margins, which are all as good as the original text, but producing highly original works based on traditional ideas. And I love this because I think that Lewis and Tolkien saw themselves as translators too, not seeking to be original so much as true. Now, there's no denying the unprecedented originality of their works, of course, but what they were doing was presenting traditional and to them incontrovertible truths in a new way. The familiar regained in the midst of the unfamiliar. Now, I'd like you to think for a moment about the stories and authors that have helped you the most and have most shaped your faith. And I'm sure you've all got someone in mind. But now, this may or may not be true for you, but what I've found is that the writers who've had the most profound impact on my walk with Christ and have most helped me understand the character and the love of God are not the ones telling me things I didn't know, so much as telling me things I'd always hoped were true. Even if I didn't have the means to consciously articulate that hope until I'd experienced it in the context of their books and stories, the hope was already there. It wasn't so much revelation as recognition. Something ancient in my soul connecting with something ancient in their stories. It's been one of the profoundest joys of my life to keep experiencing this recognition over and over and over again, to realize it's not an anomaly or a coincidence, but a pattern and a plan. George MacDonald gave me the God of love I believed in and wanted to believe in. Elizabeth Gouge pulled back the covering on the sacredness of domestic life. George Eliot, for all her struggle with Christianity, showed me the Christ-bearing potential of ordinary human beings. Gerard Manley Hopkins assailed me with the assurance that the world is indeed absolutely trembling, charged with a God who's longing to make himself known, and but the beholder wanting. Medievals would not have celebrated this fact of recognition so much as expected it. Medieval people, writes Lewis, like Professor Tolkien's hobbits, enjoyed books which told them what they already knew. Now, I mentioned earlier that Lewis and Tolkien reached back and drew upon what had enchanted them to aid in recovery. And one of these things for Lewis was a love of medievalism. For Tolkien, it was a love of fairy tale. The very best stories have the gospel at their heart. Frederick Buechner says that the gospel is first tragedy, and then comedy, and then fairy tale. According to the ancient archetypes of story, a classical tragedy always ends with the death of the hero. But classical comedy ends with a wedding. All the plot twists and misunderstandings, errors, and even sin are wrapped up and redeemed in the wedding feast because they've led to ultimate reconciliation. William Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing is a perfect example. But delightful as it is to see Hero and Claudio reconciled and Beatrice and Benedict finally get over all that pride that's been driving you crazy, it's been keeping them apart, a sense of dissatisfaction remains after the wedding feast is over and the music dies down, because the story, happily as it ends with them. A fairy tale, on the other hand, ends with happily ever after. It ends with transformation, with everyone becoming known by their true name. It ends with endlessness. Beyond comedy, the mark of the true fairy tale is an implicitly endless joy. Joy beyond the walls of the world, joy poignant as grief. And happily ever after, we catch a glimpse of the most potent and powerful function of story that there is. It's the vast consolation that defeat is neither ultimate nor final. It's the satisfaction towards which all the sufferings and longings and trials and griefs of the characters have been moving, and it can only be accomplished by what Tolkien calls the sudden, joyous turn, the eucatastrophe, or the good catastrophe, affecting in the characters an unlooked for and unending grace, and affecting in us readers that catch of the breath and beat and lifting of the heart, which is the deepest instinct for truth that we possess. In eucatastrophe, we get to see a glory spilling backwards, we catch a glimpse or hear an echo of the gospel at work in their world and in ours. Gospel-lit stories do not deny the darkness and sadness of life. They transfigure it. The gospel has sanctified, redeemed the much maligned happy ending. For as Tolkien said, this story begins and ends in joy, and there's no tale ever told that men would rather find was true. Now, I'm not suggesting that only myth and fairy tale possess this truth-bearing faculty, or that these are the only kinds of stories that we should tell or read. But what I am saying is that an engagement with the mythic imagination is needful in any effort to re-enchant the disenchanted, and that it's important to look back to what's enchanted us in our own golden age, to draw from that well in our work, to bring up not only water for a heartsick and thirsty world, but to retrieve the shell at the bottom of that pool, that small, perfect promise that the old stories are true. This is exactly what the Inklings did, and they could not have been better named, for they realized that they were dealing in hint and symbol, impression, whispers, suggestions, and glimmers. They knew that joy cannot be domesticated, and so in their stories, they created space wherein joy could pounce upon their readers unawares, and truth could seep into their hearts before it was caught and dismissed by their heads. Like the story of God covering Moses in the cleft of the rock and letting him see only the back of his garment as he passed, Lewis and Tolkien knew that the greatest and most important truths can't be stared down. They must be caught out of the tail of your eye, not merely known, but experienced. Now, this is no easy task. In fact, I would venture to say it's the most difficult work facing an artist of any discipline, but it's critical because reason is not enough, because this disenchanted world needs glimpses of a glory that's too good not to be true. In closing, I'd like to read a brief passage from T.S. Eliot's East Coker, which vividly depicts both the difficulty and the holy tranquility of this work. And so each venture is a new beginning, a raid on the inarticulate, with shabby equipment always deteriorating in the general mess of imprecision of feeling, undisciplined squads of emotion. And what there is to conquer by strength and submission has already been discovered once or twice or several times by men whom one cannot hope to emulate. But there is no competition. There is only the fight to recover what has been lost and found and lost again and again, and now under conditions that seem unpropitious. But perhaps neither gain nor loss. For us, there is only the trying. The rest is not our business.